Hello, everybody. It's us again. Normally, we would have a premiere on a Tuesday night, but we haven't quite got caught up from our adventures in Brussels, which we're looking forward to sharing with you all soon. But what we do have for you tonight is this shortish video from Laurie MacFarlane, who is part of a non-partisan think tank called Future Economy Scotland. And for me, he was the standout speech at the conference that we were at, which the Independence Forum for Scotland organised back on the beginning of March.
Yeah, I thought that as well, actually. I mean, when I listened to the speech just this morning, we listened to it again, and I thought, oh, it was so good. That was so good. I mean, it was difficult for us, not only for us, the other people who were there recording found it really hard to get good sound quality. So it's not brilliant sound quality, but it is okay, and it's really worthwhile listening to. And you can tell from what we've put on the thumbnail there, the kind of topics and that he covers, and he kind of interweaves things like private wealth and who owns that wealth in Scotland. Well, we know not very many people own it, and that's how that's kind of intersects and interacts with social inequalities, and then we get back to always the background question: how are we going to go ahead with even more and better land reform? I mean, he says, I mean, he is quite fair to the Scottish government at the beginning, isn't he? He says they have made a start. It's a good start, but it's certainly not the end. We've got to go further than that. And I really appreciated how he just wove these different aspects of social Scotland and economic Scotland together. It's great.
Anyway, we will shut up now. Let you listen. Enjoy.
Enjoy.
I'm Laurie MacFarlane. I'm co-director of an organisation called Future Economy Scotland. We're a think tank working on creating a new economy for Scotland that's democratic, sustainable and just. And over the years, a lot of my work has focused on issues related to land and housing and how these issues interact with the wider economic system. So land reform has been one of the most significant achievements of the Scottish Parliament to date, whether it's the abolition of feudal tenure, the introduction of community right to buy, the right to roam. When the Scottish Parliament was created, we did see land reform start with a bang. As the old cliche goes, though, land reform isn't a one-off event but an ongoing process. And unfortunately, as time's gone by, that initial bold ambition and enthusiasm, I think in terms of the proposals being brought forward by the Scottish Government, has started to fade a bit, as we've just heard from Ailsa. And the need for that ongoing reform, that urgent need, really can be attributed to our absolutely archaic starting point. While most democracies escaped issues of land oligopoly many centuries ago, our democratic revolution here in Scotland never really came to pass. And so while these archaic patterns of ownership were swept aside through revolution and revolt elsewhere, they survive in Scotland relatively intact to today, despite those multiple rounds of land reform legislation that Ailsa just outlined. And probably the most obvious expression of this archaic nature of the land market is the highly concentrated pattern of ownership. We just heard from Ailsa. It's estimated that 67% of Scotland's private rural land ownership is owned by just 0.025% of the population, which is essentially unprecedented and unheard of among other advanced economies. And this flies in the face of any pretension that we want to be a modern, progressive democracy, but it also very clearly inhibits entrepreneurial ambition and prevents local communities from reaching their economic potential. But the need for land reform for me extends far beyond the need to diversify concentrated land ownership, crucial though that is. Land plays an absolute fundamental role in all economies. But this role, I think, often gets kind of overlooked in the modern debate around economic policy. So alongside capital and labour, land is one of the three basic factors of production in economics. And so all activity requires land to take place. So farming requires land to produce food, developers require land to build housing, governments require land for public infrastructure, factories need land to produce goods, and even the big tech giants in today's digital economy need land for their data centres. And so even in the 21st century, when we've got, the big tech and all the new digital internet stuff, land does remain our most valuable asset in our economy today by quite some distance. And so by land, I think it's important to talk about what we mean. For me, land's not just the soil under our feet. We're really talking about physical space, and that physical space which all economic activity requires. And so how land is owned, managed and used plays a crucial role in shaping the kind of economic, social, environmental and cultural outcomes that we see. And land has some unique properties. It's scarce, it's permanent, it can be reproduced, it's immobile, and all of these things mean that the land market, when left to the market alone, doesn't function particularly well, and it's replete with what we call market failures. So the supply of land can't be easily increased or expanded to meet greater demand, again, unlike other things. And so price signals can't always be relied on to guide decisions about use efficiently. And that's why we have virtually all advanced economies, even the most market-oriented economies, have regulatory controls on land use. Today, though, Scotland's rural land market is essentially unregulated. Anyone in the world can buy large amounts of land with basically very little scrutiny, including transactions taking place off-market in secret. And without the necessary restrictions on who can own land and how much they can buy, we're seeing our policymakers unable to act to ensure that the way that land is bought and sold is actually genuinely in public interest. And we have a situation where information on land ownership still remains incomplete and fragmented, and actually accessing the data that is there is actually pretty expensive. And these long-standing issues that we've faced in Scotland for a long time are now being compounded by modern challenges. How land is owned, managed and used is going to be critical in whether we're going to be able to deliver the just transition to net zero that we need to see. As Ailsa already touched on there, the emerging value associated with Scotland's natural capital has opened up new opportunities for greenwashing and value extraction. And the rise of green layers and carbon offsetting and the huge amounts of money that are poured into Scotland's land market just to buy land for things like carbon offsets, like Ailsa said, that's exacerbating inequalities, but it's also creating new mechanisms for absentee landowners to basically extract value from local communities. And I think the recent attempts that we've seen by the Scottish Government to try and lure in more private finance into nature risks socialising risks and privatising rewards, and in many ways sort of repeating some of the mistakes we saw with PFI for infrastructure, which we know was a huge disaster. And so land reform is critical to make sure that we are actually managing our land sustainably, but also that any value arising from our nature and natural assets here in Scotland is fairly shared and not extracted in the hands of the few. Land reform is not just imperative for rural communities, though, it's equally important for urban Scotland too. We have in Scotland an unprecedented housing crisis, both in urban and rural Scotland. Throughout much of the 20th century, we had large-scale public house building programmes, together with the ability for the state to acquire land at low cost. This was very effective at keeping supply up and keeping prices under control. But ever since we saw the state retreat from playing a very active role in the land market with Thatcherism and beyond, we in Scotland have been very reliant on private speculative house builders to meet housing need. And these developers make money not predominantly by building high-quality, affordable housing. They make money by navigating the speculative housing market. And basically, in pursuit of the greatest shareholder returns, these developers often prioritise high-value urban locations and basically aim to acquire strategic land banks and then drip feed new homes onto the market at a very slow pace, deliberately to keep house prices high. Meanwhile, they ignore many crucial parts of Scotland, parts of less expensive urban Scotland as well as rural Scotland as well. And so if we're to actually deliver the affordable houses that we need in the places that we need it, we need to see a much more proactive role and public-led approach to development, as well as land reform to ensure that public authorities can acquire land at low cost. The land market also plays a really important macroeconomic role, though, and has a huge bearing on the distribution of income and wealth, and who gets what and why. And the question of who actually captures the benefit from rising land values has really been at the centre of the land reform debate for centuries. And because the value of land isn't determined by the efforts of the landowner, but by the collective investment and activity of the broader community, There's a strong argument that this value should be captured and shared to benefit for society as a whole, rather than appropriated by individual landowners. But in recent decades, though, the economic model that we have here in Scotland and across the UK has become increasingly reliant on a financialised land market to generate private wealth. Today, it's estimated that land accounts for 60% of the entire net worth of the UK, and rising land values have accounted for nearly 2/3 of all wealth created since 1995. So in terms of the actual book wealth of the country, 2/3 of that has come from rising land values just in recent decades. But of course, the ballooning wealth of property owners on the one hand has been mirrored by growing deprivation among tenants and those who don't own property. And we've seen this widening gap open up in our society between those who own property and those who don't. And indeed, whether you own property or not is one of the defining factors that will determine your standard of living over the coming decades. Not only is Scotland's financialised land market not fair, it's not particularly efficient either, and it's bad for our economy. Because the ability to extract economic rents from existing land and property assets diverts investment away from more productive and socially useful activity. And so this actually undermines economic performance, productivity, etc. So we have so much of the wealth in our society sucked up into already existing land and property, which pushes those prices up and again increases that divide between those who own property and those who don't. And so in essence, land reform is not just about tackling our archaic patterns of ownership, crucial though that is, and we're not doing enough to do that. It's also needed fundamentally to help us move towards democratic, sustainable and just economic model. And so I think it's really important that land isn't just viewed as an issue that's sort of marginal or peripheral to our economy or something that only impacts small segments of Scotland. It should be viewed as our most fundamentally important economic asset that's central to any vision of a more just and sustainable future. Now, if we agree with what Ailsa just talked about with the current land reform bill, I think it fundamentally doesn't address any of the real key issues that we have in Scotland today. I think we need to see much more robust measures to tackle concentrated ownership, to modernise governance with controls over who owns land and how much with public interest text, but also things like scaling up community ownership and supporting affordable house building. All of those things I think are missing from the current bill. But I wanted to speak a bit more about one of the biggest gaping holes in the current land reform discussion and proposals in Scotland, and that's in relation to taxation. So a well-designed tax system can incentivise the efficient and socially useful use of land, it can regulate inequalities, and it can generate significant public revenue for spending. At the moment, though, our approach to taxation of land in Scotland does the complete opposite. It incentivises the wasteful, inefficient use of land, it exacerbates inequalities, and it foregoes significant opportunities for revenue raising at a time when the public finances are very tight. And in practice, our bizarrely poorly designed tax system actually actively fuels and contributes to many of the perverse outcomes that Ailsa and I have been talking about today. So what do I mean by that? Well, firstly, let's look at housing. The system that we have predominantly in Scotland is around council tax, which remains a bit of a joke. It's unfair, regressive, inefficient. It's based on what property values were in 1991. And I think we all know what's happened to house prices since 1991. But it's not just council tax. For example, when capital gains tax was introduced in 1965, an exemption was made for primary residences for housing, which automatically put housing at a tax advantage compared to other assets. Inheritance tax is also part of the problem. Couples can now pass on up to £1 million of property wealth on to the next generation tax-free, entrenching inequalities between generations. And of course, we see the Bank of Mum and Dad in practice is now one of the biggest mortgage providers in the country, and whether people can access that or not, again, has a huge bearing on future living standards. And so this favourable tax treatment of housing, in practice, has contributed to growing demand for housing as a financial asset. And this, in turn, has been a significant factor contributing to soaring house prices, which again has contributed to this growing divide between those who own property and those who don't. And given that housing is the most valuable source of wealth in Scotland today, the fact that we tax housing so poorly means that wealth in general is significantly undertaxed. And again, at a time where the fiscal challenges in Scotland are quite real, I think this is something that really needs to be addressed. But if you look at rural land, today rural landowners benefit from a wide range of tax exemptions, which privileges land compared to other assets. So this includes various exemptions to inheritance tax, and for forestry, additional tax exemptions relating to capital gains, commercial and corporation tax. One of the significant exemptions relates to the exemption of a lot of rural land, about 90% in terms of agriculture and wooded land, from non-domestic rates. And this represents a huge distortion in the land market. And we heard of the Land Reform Review Group earlier, and as they pointed out over a decade ago, this really serves little purpose in practice other than to benefit landowners. And so I think it needs to be looked at. Now, there are a number of different options for tax reform. I would argue that the most effective solution is to replace the recurrent property taxes with a land value tax and apply it universally to all land. Economists have long recognised that land value tax is one of the most efficient ways of taxing. Because land's fixed in supply, it doesn't distort economic activity the way that other taxes do. And by attaching a cost to owning land, it diminishes the incentive to actually buy land for speculative purposes rather than actually productive and socially useful purposes. And also help ensure that increases in land values, which as I talked about before, have been the primary driver of wealth accumulation in this country. The increase in the value of land can be shared with the public purse rather than just purely appropriated for private gain. And so land value tax can play an important role stabilising the price of land, but also dampening speculative investment in it. And also, since land can't be moved or hidden, can't be sent to the Cayman Islands, it's very difficult to avoid or evade, unlike some other taxes. But our land value tax also has a strong moral basis because it aims to capture a proportion of the unearned windfalls that landowners receive from the activities of the state and wider community. So as John Stuart Mill, the political economist, said back in 1848, landlords grow rich in their sleep without working, risking or economising. The increase in the value of land arising as it does from the efforts of the entire community should belong to the community, not to the individual who might hold title. And in practice, when the value of land goes up, or indeed the value of land that sits underneath property, like a house, which is the main driver of increasing property prices, when the value of land goes up, the productive capacity of the economy as a whole is unchanged because nothing new is being produced. It just increases an increase in the value of an asset which already existed, land, and which nobody created because it's a free gift of nature. And we've known since the days of Adam Smith and David Ricardo that land is not a source of wealth, but of economic rent. It's a means of extracting wealth from others. And those early political economists worried that the ability to extract economic rents from land was so powerful that landowners could effectively usurp much of the value created in an economy. And they feared that this ability of landowners to kind of suck up a lot of the wealth in society could actually undermine the legitimacy of capitalism itself. And so they sought to limit the extent to which landowners could make unearned gains from land at the expense of others through taxation. And bear in mind the people who we're talking about are no socialists. These are the forefathers of capitalism. And so the truth is that the billions of wealth that's been accumulated in recent decades through land and property markets has been gained at the expense of those who don't own property. You'll see more of their incomes eaten up either by higher rents or have to save more or take on more debt to buy land and property in the future. And so this wealth hasn't really been created, it's really been stolen from current and future generations. And rather than resembling wealth creation, soaring land values represent wealth redistribution upwards. And so for these reasons, I think tax reform has to be a crucial part of the debate when it comes to land reform in Scotland. But I think up until now, it's really been absent, at least in terms of what the Scottish Government has been talking about. So just in conclusion, for me, it's very, very clear that an archaic, unfair, dysfunctional land market lies at the very centre of the most pressing challenges that we face here in Scotland today. Whether that's inequalities of wealth and power, whether that's a housing crisis, whether that's low productivity and poor economic performance, or whether that's an escalating crime and environmental crisis, land absolutely sits at all of them. And so I think going forward, we need to shift the way that we view land, in particular political leaders, to start seeing it for what it is, not something that's just peripheral or marginal to our society, but something that's absolutely critical and our more fundamentally important economic asset. And I think it's time to start treating it like that. Thank you.
Hope you found that as fascinating as we did. The bit that just, hit me between the eyes as soon as he said it was there's three sources of wealth. There's capital, there's labour, and there's land. And we don't think of them as equal.
Similarly, I sort of sat up when he got on to talking about how owning land can then become part of how a company or an individual can greenwash their other economic activities. And offset their carbon footprint. And I mean, it's just ridiculous that we let that happen. So have a look on their website.
We'll put the website address on the screen and in the notes, and it's actually futureeconomy.scot. And they've got a lot of webinars and things that you can watch. And we've just signed up to get their monthly newsletter because they're doing things that we're interested in. So always good to find another good source. So
absolutely,
that was useful.
Yeah.
Okay,
good.
We'll catch you all later. Bye now.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that. If you want to make sure you're following us and subscribe to us, then you get notified every time we put something new out so you don't miss anything. That would be great. Also, you can click the little bell if you're watching on YouTube.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.